Hello everyone, today we resume our question and answer video series, given that I feel the need to ramble every once in a while, and questions accumulate on YouTube as well, on my email, and you can reach me out on Twitter, on Facebook, wherever. This was an important part, actually, of Schwerpunkt up to maybe 1 year ago. Like, things changed a little bit, especially in the for the better, I would say, for the channel overall. But I used to talk a lot more about let's call them theoretical aspects. It's not quite that. Some, especially today's questions, I will stress how it really gets down to practice, and it's equally important to determine which one, right? And I don't exclude that we can come back on that. Especially those who have been following me from quite a while, that there is this Historian playlist that every once in a while people come up and say, "Oh my God, that was my favorite playlist of yours. That's favorite content, whatever." And I appreciate that. I realize that I talked really a lot non-stop about history. I don't remember when it was, like, I think 4 months ago, even the last kind of these videos. And they're really important for a reason. First of all, I've gotten in the recent times really a lot of subscribers, right? Compared to before, there are lots of people now that have joined the last couple of years that have not properly even know what Schwerpunkt has been, let's say, since the beginning, right? How the thing was born, why, etc. What are my thoughts on it? I guess that there should be a bit more of that, if not human connection per se, because you know that I don't talk in the first place much about myself, but let's say about the fact that we are making this together, in a way or another, right? The way I make videos, how I choose them, sometimes may seem arbitrary, sometimes maybe more monotonous instead. And from my side, I can say that the embarrassment of the choice increased dramatically over time, because I have really tons of things now compared in my mind, compared to the already actually pretty large amount that I had when I started the channel and as I began to develop it. So there is one good news for sure. That is, I'm never gonna exhaust the topics. It's clear, right? I will never leave enough, right, before saying, okay, well, that's more or less all I had to say, folks. So that's it. There is, again, a lot of, probably in the last months, you've seen series of some kind, because, yes, there are, say, after 5 years and almost, say, at least 4 of continuous, say, recording, surely some voids that I want to gap, if anything, because, as you know, I follow in the broader sense a sort of cycle, right? It is very varied within itself, but that over time makes you notice, what is that is really missing, or things that you could say better. You also discover new things. So before, I used to make this kind of channel updates, right, every 100 videos. At this point, I can address these topics in a broader sense, I guess, in videos like this, and I encourage you to pose questions, because it's likely that I'm going to disappoint you not answering, because I hardly ever do, and not necessarily I answer only the best questions. Actually, in a strictly historical sense, I am posed, very to the point questions to the specific videos, specific content, or even stuff like frankly, this is what happens. I get contacted privately and I say, look, do you want to make this research for me? I will pay you. Or let's say, I'm passionate about this thing in my town. Do you know what the inscription here means? And sometimes they are so very narrow things, but I mean it this time in a positive sense, that let's say I also don't answer. It may seem rude because it's true. First of all, I don't know everything, and of course, but specifically about those type of questions, we'll address them too, because you have to understand what it is that I can do and I can't do. I am a researcher, but I research on my own about things that are really, I really don't even discuss properly on Schwerpunkt. I've never, for example, made a video based on an article of mine or certain topics. Of course, they can't cross. Let's say that if I, of course, know something, I will mention it. But in general, when I talk on YouTube, it's all a different thing compared to what I do on a regular basis. So the meaning, let's say, what I care about for Schwerpunkt is naturally to provide some thought-provoking ideas regarding, say, it's not even about history, probably it's politics at the end of the day. It's the world, it's morals, it's science, it's a lot of things at the same time, as you understand. So I use the question and answer series mostly as a prompt, as a kind of source of inspiration for drawing kind of broader considerations about the topic and or things that basically get down to how I interpret the mind behind the question, which I hope is not really too judgmental or makes you feel embarrassed, for the reason for which I don't really actually get many questions about my content per se, nor about what I could do or I couldn't do. I would love actually to be asked, say, and even to disappoint you again, like, could you please make a video about this or that, right? Of course, I most of the times my plan is to cover everything, right? That is really encompassing, at least the basic historical spectrum, right? So I sometimes satisfied your demands because it had to happen statistically in the first place. But again, it's important to instead reflect on the role that this channel can have, right? I will talk at some point again about the channel update. I'm actually doing consistent updates. I'm specifically creating podcasts for every single playlist that I have, so you can have both. And it on YouTube, as you know, it's actually the largest podcast hosting platform currently existing. But as far as I've seen, it's just, again, it's the same videos, right? There is no such a thing like a true pod. I think if I don't know, if I uploaded just a track, what would happen, where I just know I can't create an endless stream of podcasts as much as I can do with the playlists, right? So there are these twins now that you can listen different ways, because there are, legitimately thinking, the majority of you listen to me just maybe while they are driving, or there are some people tell me they're working, like mechanical things, they can't listen to me. So it's obvious that my content is more cut for podcasting, at least better than for what YouTube's especially visual entertainment has gotten down to. My impression is that there's been a radical change in the last year or so regarding YouTube's mechanisms, how also videos are promoted or not promoted, things like this, that are interesting to notice as well, because I don't think there is going to be a very positive future for at least for the platform. I hope so, right? Because it is a strange one, right? They're doing really bad stuff, also politically speaking, and so on. But it's still a huge, at least for the content I make mostly, a huge medium, it has an enormous potential, and I count on at least consolidating some decent, amount of audience for eventually working with this further in other ways, even on other platforms at some point. If, I don't hope it, because this sounds hyper convenient in many ways again, but things change, and one must be prepared to that as well. So I don't know how I titled this video. I will have titled this video by now. I hope that the question doesn't sound too like whatever. I compressed the question, like, doesn't sound too general, because it's actually a general set of questions, and however with an interesting bias regarding the background, the education of the person, that can turn out useful. So this was a comment on my recent video about Roman Messian trace, which goes like this. What would you advise to someone beginning history? What's the subject matter of history? What's the best methods? When did history as a discipline begin? From the 18th century antiquarianists or from ancient Grecian figures like Herodotus? I have a Master of Art degree, but it's in philosophy. What are some good introductory texts to the discipline? Right. So this is this brings me back to the very first video maybe I made on the channel. Like, what are we doing here in the first place? And this can sound like a good update after all this time, given that things change for real, right, over the years, and so of course the ideas develop further, and just the experience I gathered from information, right, I gathered through the same questions, the followers, etc., from Schwerpunkt is being of immense impact, influence in the way I consider history now, and it's been really important. So let's go by in order. Like, what would you advise to someone beginning history? Well, I like how he phrased this, because he says not just beginning learning history, beginning history, like history as properly researched thus. Well, this, of course, can be answered universally. History's purpose is to find meaning, in my opinion. You cannot differentiate historical research from a scientific one. It means literally the same thing. This partly answers the part on method I would maintain as singular. I will explain later and better why. So really starting from a general background, whichever it is, of course you should just go by what really interests you, right? The will to power and the achievement of any kind of goal pass through whatever you think. It's essentially a bet, right? On what you think. It may sound crazy, but like, what happens if I open this door, if I get that far, or if I really am able, in fact, to put a new concept together? This can't be simply, I understand this is a philosophy, the student has a philosophy master degree, so he probably wants to go to the philosophical, to existential root of the whole thing. I think it's just written in our genes, right? We know that humans must make sense of things, must bring order where there is chaos. They're literally attracted to that, even against the instinct of survival. So it is a struggle, right? I follow the traditional doctrine of struggle and victory. So the idea is that there is really an all-round existential involvement in this. Your entire life is history. We are all historians in this sense. An advice would always depend on how the person, say, feels about the thing and decides to do, what's the background, the context. It also depends on, naturally, the different background that here is provided, right? What do you advise someone beginning history, right? So hopefully you would begin learning something about history, at least from childhood. Admittedly, we all do, because we're all exposed to something historical from that time, and that is really, as you know, sticking right with you. And childhood is an enormously important time for learning. In the first place, your parental background, let's say the one at least, right, wherever you're being brought up, is going to define you in great part as an individual, because you're just going to be exposed yourself to it, and so you're going to shape yourself eventually into the adult, right, through the journey. I think, however, one important advice there is to always stay true to yourself. I mean, I've always been hopefully, I have my faults, but one thing I've always been very proud of is the fact that I've never accepted or say given for certain or for true, as a matter of fact, or secure any kind of explanation that I hadn't been able to sort out, or to understand, at least to explain myself. Right? When you're a kid, you do pose a lot of questions, because at that point your brain is like a sponge. You really, again, sediment a lot. And kids actually are very smart, right? Very intelligent and very, very receptive, not just curious per se. And it seems to me that we live in an age in which, and part of the question brings me there, as we will see, we tend to think that there is, by default, a sort of guide that we should follow, without which basically we can't build up one's own. Indeed, especially when you're young, here we're probably past that, at least in the phase of, just before your prefrontal cortex successfully consolidates, which we all know how important it is to have been developing instead properly a view on your own, right? So when you're younger, instead, especially in your early 20s, something like that, you're a bit of an iconoclast. You think that essentially you have been lied to by everything and everyone, and so you want to break the thing and put all together, right, your own way. Except for finding out that a great part of things that also you broke down were actually good, right? That there are some, I find myself at that point, there were some things that I believed as a kid that were not just about history, more correct, that some that I eventually replaced those with for a while, at least temporary, before in fact realizing back again that things were in kind of that way. But there is a very subtle balance between following authority and having an opinion on your own. It should be constantly balanced, right? I know there are people who tend to be either one or the other. There are others who instead manage to balance the two things just characterally, right? There is a good part of people that tendentially follows, right, by character, right? They want to refer to specific figures either as models or as, let's say, as a sort of source of inspiration, or let's assume a bit like that they feel comforted by these figures, these characters, or similar things. Others instead are path makers, right? They actually disdain anyone in that along that way, and they just want to make the thing on their own. I happen to follow in the latter, and sometimes I must tell you, like, there's been times, in fact, in my own historical path in which I was too detached from scholarship, and it wasn't that bad because I still think that, generally speaking, sources are better. But of course, there should be a healthy hierarchy, right, of what really matters or not, which is not just about following people or scholars or just the sources per se and so on. And what seems to me is that especially the younger generations nowadays will have a complete lack of actual structure and points of reference and kind of fixed ground which to stand, which in absolute terms may not be even just the end of the world, but in certain moments of your life, especially at the beginning, where that's the crucial moment in which they will not have had it, is extremely damaging. It can, in fact, impair all the rest of the path at some point, and that's the reason why we see mental illness skyrocketing in parallel with the abandonment of tradition. It's not even about that this decay has been going on from a while, right? Most self-styled traditionalists, let's say, do not even know what tradition actually is, nor they have probably never heard of that. Even if they know the word or whatever, they actually fool themselves into thinking things that tradition rejects as the diametrically opposite meaning of, and actually, in that sense, lack at all, because they literally, again, do not know tradition. Rather. I will not talk about tradition today just per se, because here the question is about the research proper, right? So I will not tell you, let's just go read tradition. That's not how it works. First of all, even those fields are mined, because tradition is not something to be gnostically learned. And in fact, most of the self-styled traditionalists are essentially gnostic heretics, right? And they actually think that tradition was about Gnosticism, and that is one of the greatest mistakes that has nothing to do with Christianity or whatever. It is probably the complete denial of any form of tradition. And it often stands out in this regard, like, where do I would say, even speaking for myself, until in your life you wonder what kind of position to say, what kind of side to pick, right? It means that there is something, if you're still wondering and not really getting to a point, sometimes even for years, about even important, even political issues, moral themes, and so on, the question is, you're not ready yet, right? If you're waiting for somebody else giving you the answer, right, and or not being able to decide yourself, you will always admittedly find yourself in some of these situations, but the degree by which this happens tells you how much work you still have to do, right? I can speak for myself. Schwerpunkt saved probably my own, I don't know, but maybe not existence, but let's say that there is something as a historian, given that the question is about this, that I could have not properly grasped, and that's the greatest problem. Not knowing that something exists before learning it, or knowing, right, what it's really about, that you cannot know before learning it, actually, that will make you really dissatisfied with most things that, in fact, you do not understand. You will always feel essentially under a superstition, right? You will always essentially hope that things will go well, but you will never see the logic of that, right? I think that history has this specific purpose, because the more you learn about that, and at the end of the day you learn about politics, about war, about society, that's what history basically gets down to, at least in the way we make it in terms of what matters hierarchically. That's the Clausewitz and Trinity, by the way. And not only that, you can't quite get anywhere, I think, with your life in the first place. So this is surely an advanced situation, but it's a type of a conversation that you should be having with yourself, especially by the end of your 20s at the latest, because while until that time you must go into the meat grinder, and you have to in fact develop properly a backbone on your own. later than that, if you still haven't fixed these things, it is really complicated to put your life back together, and you may become ever more dissatisfied really about yourself. So beginning history, given this context, like you have a master degree in philosophy, and so you already know what certain aspects are really about, learning some university level, and I don't know what, again, kind of political, moral, cultural background you come from. I will try to be neutral in that regard, even though with the thing of tradition, perhaps, I already betrayed myself, but right, that, and it's completely fine to be open about that, because if the thing gets down to, I'm a materialist and a determinist, well, at that point, it's quite unlikely that history is going to have any meaning, right? As basically anything is going to have any meaning, and any kind of agnostic separation of two things, saying, well, but I accept it, it's all determined, and there is no broader, living archetype out there, metaphysical dimension, but I still want to see that meaning yourself. Well, that very thing, that doesn't make sense, right? This very statement doesn't have any sense, and history should actually be about revealing it, right? And sometimes I will skip also the considerations about like the negative influences you may have, also just as historical models or even as teachers, right? There are people who hate a certain period or any topic just because they had terrible teaching about that, or they have never surpassed maybe certain bad memories about certain exams or whatever. But there is that influences. It's normal as well. But it also helps finding what you really need, right? There is a process of selection, of taking down certain things rather than others. The process of beginning, though, is not that easy, because as you will see now, I don't believe there is any. I believe there is a specific method which is still universal and unavoidable in nature, but I don't really think there is anything like a book, right, or an author, or a specific manual just to approach history per se, right? It should all stem from a life experience, and what, again, you have felt mostly inspired by, right, to go get, right, sorted out, and so on. But again, the main advice is trying to be objective, right? If, for example, there is something within you that you understand is heavily biased because of whatever the reason, politically, morally, personally, whatever, you should first of all try. History can do partly the work for you, but let's say it's not merely a story that will make you do that. You must have the courage of facing yourself and saying, look, we have to rediscuss this aspect of our beliefs, of our life, of our behavior, because this may spoil the actual work. As I said before, if the reason I see it on YouTube, especially among historians, which is something sad. Like, this happens mostly for the Anglosphere or very Anglosphere-oriented countries, even in Europe, continental Europe, that, again, materialism, Marxism, or something that is flavoring that way, that may be taken by these people as sort of just, I'm a liberal or a leftist, it's okay, but there is something history that is separated from that, that is quite disconcerting, right? And I know, even I can't say that they're bad historians, or maybe they didn't learn the historical method, whatever, but my impression over time is being that it's not much about method per se, but it's how much you work that actually makes the difference, and how much things you know complexively that really matters in history to actually have a good understanding of something like that. right? If you are like an adult person and you still think that there is an evil conspiracy about how, in the West we have described the Soviet Union or minus China, and so it's all a sort of scam. It wasn't so bad, man. It was basically the same thing like in the Western Bloc. Well, then you may have severe moral, personal, and cultural problems. This is not a matter of personal opinion or judgment or whatever. It's just wanting to be edgy, right, to the point of, oh, look, I can't handle things that most people think it's bad, because maybe there is a reason why that is actually the case. But I'm not concentrating just on the aforementioned examples, but it's a bit of a typically youngster kind of attitude, right, wanting to shock, wanting to be extremistic. And I don't know where all these kind of left-leaning students will be like in 10, even just 10 or 20 years from now, right? Normally you get more conservative with age, right? And I would say I was lucky enough to see in my university background that for whichever communistic influence had been existing after World War II, this had substantially been diluting, and mostly as historians in the actually very high ranked, to say the least, university in the world. The question is that we are fundamentally all conservatives. I haven't found, admittedly, many traditionalists per se. There is a sort of course, say, temper character of the time, right? Tradition is not really taught, as I was saying before, and I know theists, I know people who have, generally speaking, even a very solid, in fact, spiritual, cultural background that strive, like, to find that place and to interpret that kind of broader meaning. Why? Because the concept is that they have, and university often does this, they have hyper specialized. They have gone maybe down whatever favorite rabbit hole they were they preferred with their PhDs, with their research, whatever. But they will essentially remain stuck into it, so they will not look around. And the only chance they had to have a broader understanding of the world, basically say, okay, well, I will learn it later, and then you never will, and you know that. That's why I was saying that Schwerpunkt somehow saved, I think, my my faith in history as well, as much as in what I do, and in something more meaningful in existence, because I was in that situation myself, meaning that I was, say, confident, at least in as much as I managed myself to score my hits and to go on with my circle career and so on. But having made all these videos about really lots of different topics, but as you can see here, really a lot, I realized that I had no clue, right, of some of the paradoxically most microscopic and obvious in general aspects of history. That, in fact, are often criticized by, say, at least there are lots of conspiracy theorists out there. There are a lot of superficial, material, say, completely incompetent people, and especially populism, right, in last decades has showed this, right? The idea that, people confuse essentially tradition with a sort of paranoid superstition that is, in fact, the opposite of it, of saying, there is some sort of gnostic, again, promised land that if you truly and paranoidly alienate yourself from reality will magically materialize. This is not actually what tradition really is. Tradition is based on action, right, and on the actualization of the self, and on actually on actual power, right, not wishful thinking. And surely it is plenty of Saudi historians that have a lot of grip on masses, very even successful YouTubers for that matter, which I am evidently not, at least, that of course, go by things, I don't know, Spengler cycles, and pretending that that's an actual thing. But let's say it may be an actual thing, in as much as everything can be an actual thing. And there is always, again, that magic balance. That is the thing that makes you really do easy things. Instead, here we're talking about the application, also the method of these individuals, as, of course, something that is actually deterministic. You see, if it is not traditional, it tends towards determinism, and towards superficial analysis, approximations. Why do you think a great part of these individuals load themselves, and I say it as a Clausewitzian and as military historian, with the concept of geopolitics, right? There is actually a historical geopolitics that is an almost serious thing that, however, refers to very specific concepts that are still brutally approximated and not conceptually different and wrong as much as, I don't know, Jomini's précis de l'art de la guerre, right? You can be genial, insightful, you can have a great intuition, whatever, but if you do not stick to reality, things are not going to work in it, right? That's the reason why I have a Clausewitzian series that essentially deals with the method that I use specifically in military history, but it's not really just about that. It's actually a broader moral and scientific view of the world, right? So the point being is that if beginning to learn history is just, okay, let's read even lots of books, right? Even 50 or 100 or 200 or whatever, and say, okay, now I have a historical culture, even though I have a degree in something else, whatever. That's not actually how it's going to work, right? There is a difference between, again, mere knowledge and then an actual application, an actual, say, development, an actual effort, right? Made to striving to understand certain specific things rather than other. And there is a huge difference, as explained often in this kind of videos, between reading, learning, studying, understanding, also researching for that matter. That is the most important thing, and I do believe, unfortunately, that without probably a professional type of approach, it's not much that you cannot learn about history or becoming even knowledgeable about that, or being a pleasant interlocutor at dinner or whatever. But let's say the reliability of that information and whatever that can be useful for you is going to be very, or for whichever other field, as a matter of fact, can be useless, right? Here, I don't want to criticize the degree, nor the theme. We'll get to that, by the way, because I'm a historian. I have to roast a philosopher, what you want. That's part of of our job, as a matter of fact. But I really mean titles in general. Again, I can't say it as a PhD myself, that it's not having a PhD, and so even less anything down to that actually makes you, first of all, right. I was about to say a good person, but I don't think that's even what it should get down to, depending on what you mean by good, by the way. But let's say it doesn't necessarily make you an expert, which doesn't necessarily make you someone who is capable of looking at a greater scale, right, of complexity based on reality, because that's also what we do as historians, and sorting it out, right? There is literally a different stage of development that until you climb to there's not really a top, right? The top would be, the apotheosis, right? And then things would all magically unfold. But let's say that until you get to a step, right, you cannot know how it really is, right? And so at that point, it's a sort of transcendental experience, right? I'm told by people who make drugs, for example, that this is something that they feel that when they get to the top, literally, then they feel it's very dangerous. Not much just because of the physical addiction to the substance in that case, but literally for the moral effect that it really has, which is all one with that, just not to be too Cartesian again. In as much as you're not satisfied essentially with something less, right? And so you will have been disappointed at yourself, the one you were before, because you have actually shaped up, you have actually matured, you have really gotten to a place where you can handle much more complex issues, even maybe about other subjects that are not your own, but that you can evaluate on the basis of what you know. And I must say that history is quite useful in this, because admittedly you can really make either, again, just a hyper specialistic use of it, or you can be just reading. You can choose really a wide amount of knowledge. But let's say this general culture that you should cultivate over the decades, and hopefully, right, in a professional sense, to really get to the point, should really come together with power, right? With something you can immediately translate into practical effect, right? And expanding it, thus making an intelligent use of whichever like information you own, right? So there is no doubt that everyone knows something that somebody else doesn't, right? The most ignorant person in the world surely knows something that the most cultured person does not, right? And vice versa, right? But here, in fact, this is not a morally relativistic statement. There is a huge difference objectively between the two things, right? Now, again, I will not make philosophy. I will try just to explain my historical experience. But there is this tendency, and I've seen it, to relativize everything. Essentially to say, we should just question everything, as I was saying before, as a kid, right? But to essentially destroy everything. No, that's the actual opposite direction. You should question anything to know exactly how the thing works, because there is only one way which it works, right? It can be different paths to it. There can be different experiences. We all have one. There is not such a thing like a single thought, right? Even in the most whiny, fiction, fantasy of conspiracy theorists, possible just by moral and scientific capacity. And that's where also you should measure your own pulse, in as much as what is that you actually want to believe, right? That the first thing that appears evident at that point is you were believing a lot of BS that you essentially made up yourself for compensating for the evident lack of knowledge in other fields, right? So I'm unfortunately I'm not usually a pessimistic person, but I surely don't have a positive outlook on the value of education, right? There may be more education quantitatively, but this has nothing to do with its quality, right? And especially when you realize that quantity is expanding just because the system is expanding, so that there is nothing really qualitative about a bigger, say, what should be required also in an exponentially qualitative way to handle such large of a system. Disaster is next door. Right, and this doesn't refer to anything in particular, right? Nor politically, nor whatever. It literally means this from a scientific point of view, right? It can be everything, not what you more likely expect, or what again, I'm saying but here I'm not referring to the person who made the question, to the average yourself, right? That is often exactly what you couldn't know, you couldn't see coming, because you were fundamentally too ignorant or too dumb, right, to do so, right? I must say that, like, maybe that's what would make my channel more successful, but I don't do it. That is, politics has become somewhat very easy to this point. That is to say, now that it has simplified itself, you realize how complex it actually is. But let's say this concept again, posing yourself question, well, let's sort the thing out, right? It definitely, because you don't know at the end of the day what's right, what's wrong, but what the hell is going on, so that you have to make up scarecrows to pretend that you are a righteous person, well, that's, again, not a good sign overall. There are people who spend their entire life in this condition, probably the majority, but that corresponds to an objective level of individual underdevelopment. And I also have grown consistently more intolerant, harsher, surely more confident too, because that's also what you really like. If you start scoring, you highly realize that this thing is working, right? So there's not really, at least under those parameters, much that can be denied. Admittedly, yes, there are systems that are rigged, etc., but you are the first person who knows when you're doing something bad, when you're a fraud, or you're doing something that others think is good, but you know too well that really ain't more than much. So I must say it's also very easy to trick people in general, which may sound disturbing, but it's funny because it's people who want to get tricked themselves. That's how we should be seeing it too. So beginning history definitely entails being aware of this vertical dimension, the necessity of objectivity, right, which has nothing, actually is reinforced by plurality, because it's only by comparison that you can determine whether something is better or worse. And again, in history, relativism doesn't work because it's just what happens that worked. So you can't, and you have to explain it as a job, right? So we tend to cut like the speculative BS at the root in history, especially, I must say, when history is done properly. We will see now what the method is and works, or is supposed to be, at least. And instead, again, every individual, every human failure stems from exactly thinking about things that do not really exist. And you understand that the entire cognitive sphere is in part about this. We're all making up something to reason in some ways, but then it has to be successful too. So I think that actual achievement, that actual manifestation of power, is what should bring you to learn more about history, which is something you hardly hear, because the historians seem, again, the weird guy dressed in an old-fashioned with glasses in a studio and makes interviews in all, talking about irrelevant details that nobody knows, but he does, right? So at least we're comforted by this old style guy that is out there. But it's not really that. At least I sympathize with concept, because I do believe that there should be some sort of storytellers, or people that eventually speak to a broader audience. There are a lot of historians on YouTube that are really at some point chosen because they're more like entertaining people than actually good historians, right? And again, when people do not understand the difference, like the myth that history has to be engaging the students, telling them anything that basically history is not, right? Thanks my eyes, right? I can't become a comedian and going to school, right? And teaching kids, but I will never go to school teaching, by the way. That's also because I don't need it, frankly. But just referring to that kind of model, right? The fact that down with homework and we down with discipline and hierarchy. No, that's exactly when the step that has made education collapsing by magnitudinal scale, and it's the cause of countless damage at any level of humanity. Literally, easily millions of people have been dying because of that, as a consequence of that. And because at the end of the day, what that really means is that we are too lazy to actually move our ass and doing something about our own life. That's exclusively what it means. And there is no shock also that it's been widely research that IQs have been going down since the 1970s, right? So there is nothing especially to flatter oneself about being an average person, which is another thing that I believe is incompatible with history as an activity, meaning that that's about a moral elevation, right? And it doesn't take anything to be more, say, better than the average. But especially it doesn't take anything to know more history than the average, right? And this is very sad because, again, it should take really, hopefully, a lot, because lots of people are really good and they know a lot of history, but it turns out not to be the case by the slightest, right? So here it goes. Like, I could naturally go on rambling on this, but also the question has to be answered fully. At least there is like a link here. It says what's the subject matter of history? Well, I think I just answered in a way. But if one wants to get down to what history really means, right? The subject matter, what you will learn as a story, is the aforementioned, of course, politics, war, and society, that are all equally balanced. That is to say, there is not they all have a different role, right? And they're often equivocated, right? History is mostly taught as a social science nowadays, but it doesn't mean, again, that it should be the case. There is definitely, again, it's not a conspiracy theory that after World War II, mostly, Marxism has somehow decided to, essentially proliferate in the schools, in the universities, and whatever. Believe me, it's really not. I mean, it's just history. Everybody really knows. It's a statistic dimension. Ask just how many of the teachers really are of this party or another. Like, it's really evident, right? It's not a conspiracy theory. It's normal. You should also easily explain why that happened, right? It's not just about, the Nazis were right-wing. Were they? Right? National Socialism, if you ever wonder that, is, again, not how those cool people that study, political theory or, history of politics tell you, no, National Socialism is not socialism because it's two different things studied. The fact that, say, different polities call themselves in different ways in different countries in different context doesn't mean that if I called myself like literally nationalist socialist and I have Das Kapital in my backpack while I actually invade the same Soviet Union, that doesn't mean anything, right? It's literally socialism. And if anybody has studied, again, historically how even Nazi Germany or fascist Italy were run, they were some of the most centralized, right, statalized systems. They had a massive, welfare state, social measures of some sort, because they were definitely expanding massive for those times in relative terms, it's part of a broader historical problem. I mean, you wouldn't have to be surprised by that. It's not much that somebody has to explain you, because that's how the inexperienced operate, right? They try to make the ABC label list of things to learn by heart, but of course not understanding anything of why that came to be. This is typically, especially of, again, a certain half of the West, that is, very cheap, superficial, theoretical analysis of or just, again, passive learning of certain aspects, whatever you're told to learn. There is nothing strange in, it's a microscopic evidence of the reason why fascism or Nazism, or together with socialism, with communism, broke out so violently, especially in the early 20th century, and even besides World War I, right? Of course, things would have gone differently in a historical sense in that degree, but it's part of a massive, scholarly massive phenomenon that is kind of obvious, right? The masses took over, and what did you think would happen? Like, do you know who the masses are? Again, and this goes in reverse, and that's what we do as history, and we do as, just what, again, answer who those masses really were. What did they learn? Where did they come from? Who were these people 100 years before? What did they know? What did they learn? And that's a question that, again, the average person it's not that they can't answer, but they do not want to answer because, of course, they're terrified by the realization that, of course, being an average person has basically no meaning. So the subject matter of history, it should be directed towards those accomplishments that really occurred politically, militarily, and socially, to the simple and obvious realization that they changed history, right? If you learn just social history, for example, or if you think that, why don't we study more history of women? Well, because even though there is no doubt that women have always been of radically excruciating and crucial importance in every time in history, objectively, what was done at the higher level, that was male-made, and of course this has deep reasons in the functions that those communities really had, really made the prevalence of the most important historical figures being male, right? And so you cannot make somebody's life only about, okay, let's study just women history, not because it's just the other neglected 50% that was equally important and was not studied. No, that's complete moral relativism. This is lacking a macroscopical, objective understanding of reality by default, which you should explain mostly through parental upbringing or lack thereof, and of course complete failure of the education system, just not to make a person intelligent enough to realize that, of course, we must give the proper importance to things that actually had an importance. So first of all, there is not just society, right? I'm a great fan of evidential history as a military historian, also because I've heard countless times, and this is somewhat shocking for someone who at least expects for such interlocutors an historical background, things like, I don't know, those who were criticizing the Histoire Bataille were just Marxist socialists who wanted to study just society and canceling military history, as it literally happened, for example, after World War II, while, of course, the people who actually started that structuralistic schools were incredibly well learned about, at least, the general, in fact, evidential history, also because, admittedly, that's the only thing that, in part, also existed in that sense, but that, of course, knew perfectly well, and that absolutely would never tell you it would take away the military or political or even evidential dimension from history, as most kids and adults still actually believe nowadays, and were actually some of the most staunch supporters, for example, of resistance. They were involved also as they fought in the war. They volunteered, etc., because they had actually a much deeper kind of historical, political, and civic awareness than else, right? You cannot look at, of course, the first half of the 20th century from both sides, both from the fascists and from the communist side, and simply saying, these people didn't know what they were actually doing. Like Lenin did study von Clausewitz, and he won the Russian Civil War because of that, right? Surely I'm not a person who has any particular sense of endearment towards Lenin, but still history was made in that way, and as a historian I must recognize that, because it also shows, again, the degree to which tradition and modernity, the latter of which I don't believe it actually exists, and I think it's just a bit of a phantom to cope for the lack of tradition, but let's say let's intend modernity as the capacity of tradition to cope with new challenges, which is a completely different thing. And as I was saying before, there is only one standard, so you can't have really two massive dichotomies, as if humans every once in a while switch from, I don't know, let's wake up in the Enlightenment and switch from tradition to modernity. It never happened. As a matter of fact, they were believing, largely at least, that they were following tradition still, except they studied it and understood it ever less, aside from having a very different moral predisposition. Again, everything changes with time. But everything has an explanation. And history is aimed at explaining that. It's in many ways about what's subject matter of history, finding cause-effect links, in a way. But it's also, again, about the perspective in importance between, let's say, one thing and another, right? Politics is really about how do you study politics? What is politics, right? Probably philosophy poses itself to many questions in this regard. What really matters is, do you know what it gets down to? Subject matter, history, what governments did, right? And even in times in which we cannot identify, say, governments just per se, and we live still in a time in which we thought, as it's really still the same thing, which it's really individuals who do things. Even though the community aspect, often, again, the self-styled traditionalists forget this aspect, that the community does exist, right? It's just shouldn't be seen as metaphysical, but by conventional terms, right? You manifest your own power, political one, because there are people who you manage to control, and that, as we've seen, decide to be controlled, to confer part of their, depending on how you want to see the thing, of their power to you, right? That's the subject matter of history. And there is something deeply spiritual about that. The same goes with war. War has a very, say, specific, in fact, military dimension that you cannot separate from politics consequentially, but that you can and you must appreciate, because at some point political and social considerations depended literally on the outcome of a war, and they always do, because all these three are mixed. And so if you do not actually understand how an army works in a campaign, and what are the strategic implications of her presence there, what are the objectives, and what is at stake, and how much can be wiped out if that army fails or succeeds from one side or another, respectively, you cannot understand history. You cannot say, okay, well, I will study war, I will study, I don't know, the propaganda war in these 2 years from the perspective of this guy. Who the fuck cares about that? If you want to study war, study how the freaking army corps were working on the field, for which purpose, and with which expectation. And that's something that requires, again, a very specific kind of, background and preparation. The same goes with society. Society is, in this sense, more... it's a freer topic in a way, but even there, major indicators in a religious, in an economic, anything that you can think has an impact on how people live, what they do in a day, or what are their mental structures, fundamental for the few that you can't reconstruct naturally in practice, but those are necessary. They're not never see. In this regard, even in the evaluation of the individual in the masses, the masses as just people with empty brains per se, they already had, if they went in a direction rather than another, a reason for making that decision, and that's what you have to try to figure out. And I think it's the funniest aspect of history, because you're talking about real people, and yes, sometimes it's frustrating, right? It's easy to romanticize the past and to see in it things that weren't really that way, and there is definitely in the philosophy of history a lot to discuss in that sense. But again, I'm a historian, not a philosopher, so more or less I try to approximate these things through, again, the scientific method. I don't think there is a set of methods when it gets down to history. It's really the same scientific one applied to sources that, again, all have a specific technicality that, in fact, from their context, really tell you a lot, right? And that only by working with you can fully appreciate, right? I could open an enormous digression on the even here, it's always about essentially defeating your limits, the unexpected information that a source can provide you with, but not, say, explicitly in a sense, oh, look, you're reading me, nobody has found me yet but you, so I tell you the magic thing that solves it. No, but I really mean how many connections really exist between sources, right? Even in apparently very scantily documented times, this is what has always impressed me. There is always, you cannot say really a pattern, if not maybe just in what you experience as a man, right? Meaning that the connection between sources, once you read it, come normally, right? And again, it's unavoidable to see patterns, not because, again, of the larger cyclical ones. History is really a mess, and when you write, when you work with it, you really get into that hyper specialistic rabbit hole, because you realize how complicated it is also to venture out of that, and how much there is to dig, right, about certain specific sources that you thought everybody had read and understood, and instead, by rereading over and over and just trying to answer those questions that have made you do this whole thing in the first place, really start revealing you some knowledge. It's as if I don't know, as a neurocognitive experience, I don't know how it's ever been studied, but it's as if you feel like there is some molten gold that start flowing into your head. Like you start sensing how precious that knowledge that manifests itself really is, and it gives you like an incredible hype and confidence and security. And then the most beautiful aspect of that is that if you make a mistake, that sense of accomplishment will instead transform itself in one of frustration. But at the same time, this always happens, will have told you, as Popper says, much more than what you thought it was possible to be known. And very often, like, whatever doesn't really doesn't ring satisfactory, really trying to approximate through hypotheses, through theories, and so on, very often instead turns out much clearer, much simpler, because reality is really much simpler than it seems, right? It really is, right? Everything, like we say, oh my god, politics and war and society, oh my god, they're so complicated. They're complicated at best to understand, right? But all we know how things work is really simple, and getting to that kind of core awareness that it's the simplest things that are really the hardest at a point, that clarifies your entire say the necessity of getting down to not to simplify the picture, but to realize that the picture is the consequence of an inherent essence that has created those accidents, not as again as an unpredictable chaos, but it's something that makes sense for each of these situations. This can happen only if you expand the knowledge of the causes and the consequences to that point. And it is not, again, what normally instead the simplification of interpretations is done like. That is to say, inventing a new, say, a factor, a primigenial cause that has nothing to do with that, putting it next to it and trying just to make it work with it. That as soon as you start inquiring the historical matter, that the thing crumbles, and that's the easiest way to debunk, generally speaking, people's delusions, right? Because also most of what we really need has already been done, not even told, right? It's not important to be told. I don't want to leave you with this sense that you can read that book and it's written how it literally happens. Again, that's kind of agnostic sort of delusion, that there is the cheap shortcut that makes you cooler. No, right? The real cut, and I really mean it, is doing your homework, right? The best way to cheat everywhere is to actually study. And it's so easy, right? Because it works all the time, right? That's the best cheating you can ever and successfully make, right? So I really believe the subject matter of history is about this general, history of mankind, that would have actually other, like, I will not descend into what I think, I mean, some theories really are. I would say, if we can't talk about methods specifically, I would advise, at least I think in my experience it was very useful, I would advise to really wander in the extremes, right? I think a complete education allows you de facto to do so, right? If you, I don't know, in high school you have studied history or philosophy in a competent way, so philosopher after philosopher from, I don't know, Thales of Miletus, and then up to the mid 20th century or even beyond. Well, if it is done seriously, it's really cool, right? You study all the ideologies that were out there, probably in a superficial way in school, whatever, but still you have an idea of what more or less people thought and why, and you start toying with those ideas, especially during adolescence. It's incredibly important to have that preparation. And I would say that the modern thinking, right, I think parenting should be about tradition. Schooling should be provoking you through modernity. I'm not saying modernity as the access towards some sort of, in fact, other ideological perversion. I really mean, again, the sense, let's study things as if, not necessarily as if there wasn't a God, right? But not really focusing on that, right? Trying to give certain skills, right? And in as comprehensive and complete as possible as far as various subjects are, basically giving you a mini, like in 13 years of school, a mini knowledge of the entire world, right? As far as history, maths, philosophy, physics, geography, really everything you can imagine. And at that point, in a neutral sense, because I think that's the best way to fundamentally, avoid even all these debates about, like, I come from a lay background, even in my school, and in this I'm very proud, because again, I think that I received a good education as far as that was concerned. And I'm very shocked to hear at least certain contexts in which the actual debate in schools is not legitimately depriving, say, cleaning them of any kind of ideologism, which is objectively a saint enterprise, but, say, trying to substitute an ideology with another, right? Let's suppose that, again, the entire, as you know, I even teach history of religions. I'm very fond of that. Have a huge respect. I believe that who doesn't actually study religion is a hopelessly ignorant person, right? And I seriously doubt about their capacity to vote or to like their role as citizens, right? But for this very reason, let's say a struggle between theism or atheism as a general alternative to one another, I think it's nonsensical, right? You can teach what we know from biology, and actual biology, that can be wrong, maybe, right? There is no doubt about the fact that it's, like, at least for how, let's put it in this way, these fields are so complex that even the fact, it's just an exercise, right? Even the fact of learning that degree of complexity is useful, because if you learn that, then you can apply it to everything, right? Do you really remember your biology class in schools? I don't think so, right? You mostly were programmed to remember certain things that you do not remember exactly when you learn and how you learn, but then most of that you have to review on books to be particularly precise about, to have the exact vocabulary, the competence, the information. Because most people evidently don't have. Everybody can say that, like, say easily for myself. But what is, in that sense, the point of debating over whether a God existed or in absolute terms did not exist, right? I think it's an incredibly stupid idea, right? This is something that, again, you must surely study in philosophy instead, where in many ways, or history of religions, which is also a class, at least where I come from, in the schools, and that is not a catechism in disguise. It's actually about also other religions in general. And that should make you reflect, in fact, on this topic. That is a pretty serious one, a pretty sensitive one, there is no doubt, but that should be treated as, okay, let's learn about this. Let's learn what this is about, more or less how I think maybe not how I teach, really, or I talk about, because I don't use cathedratic ways here, as you know. But even on Schwerpunkt, by saying, look, this is what these peoples believed, and their entire system of beliefs was about this figures were this did that, and so, the entire point of politics, of rule was about this and that, and it's so easy, right? Once you get the essentials there, you can understand that, you can debate the essentials, you can, especially when, again, there are horrifying, history of religion manuals written after, that have basically erased the sense of compared, that have brought structuralism into religion, let's put it in this way, and emptied it of the actual sacred meaning. And so how can you teach that to a person, right? How can you teach history of religions without insisting on the concept of sin and how people's developed that universal, and just making a list of deities and even pretending there was ever such a thing like polytheism, which objectively never existed, and in fact feeding people with this BS. So this is not, again, to say that everything that is told to you is correct per se, and that's why I think families are much more, incomparably more important than schools or any other educational institution. Because you should be told when you come home, look, hi boy, what did you learn in school today? You should be having a conversation about that, because I think that that's also what parenting is about, because that was maybe not literally the case for the same words for me, but I would talk with my parents always about, generally speaking, what I learned in school, or at least how it was going. So I never gave much problem to them, but it was at least something fascinating at some point, right? Some certain things I learned in school, I legitimately wanted just to tell to my family, because they say, did you know about this? Did you know about that? And having a conversation, a dialogue, it's crucial for somebody's upbringing. And so in that context, you should be warned as well, because you're just a minor, and so you are basically unreliable by a substantial degree throughout the way. That, look, this thing maybe has been told to you by this teacher in this way, but consider this and that, because, there is this and that. You should offer, like, an explanation, especially as a parent, that is parallel to the one that the teacher said. You shouldn't say, this is an idiot, because this guy, he's a theist, or is an atheist. It's very easy. I've met plenty of imbecilic theists and atheists throughout all my life, right? And the problem to me was never about religion. I started studying religion on my own, right? And I've always loved it. So it didn't impress me at all. Again, the feeling is, look at these noobs that do not understand a fuck even about the things that they think it's so deeply important to them. They've not even made the effort of opening an actual book, right? A history of religion, and to educate themselves. And these are actually teachers, right? So that's where I've always felt like we're not here to calm lies, right? And so also the attitude towards, again, not ever being satisfied with an explanation, and for all the mistakes. I was being, about to be kicked out of university at least 3 or 4 times, because I, took on, like, because they were saying wrong things, and I wasn't to shut up, right? At least at that point. That's why my prefrontal cortex had not been satisfactorily solidified, because to this point I wouldn't just give a damn. There is a bit of, maybe not of protagonism, but sense of, we should intervene. There is at least a useful purpose, even in critique and so on. But those experiences also teach you how beyond you should be, right? If you're going to crash them, you have to worry much more for a tiny shortcoming of yours than their massive one, right? And so that's what also history is really, like a constant refinement of your own capacities, or of your own, basically of your own potential, right? And development, it's always about that, really. It never ends. There's not an ending point of arrival. So so much so that it's difficult to talk about a point of beginning, right? Now, this question, when did history as discipline begin, from the 18th century antiquarianists or from ancient Grecian figures like Herodotus or whatever? Well, as a medievalist, I'm very, my heart is very much from, with the 17th, 18th century antiquarianists, right? Especially Muratori and the Monumenta Germania Historica, mostly, like, of course, I studied the Holy Roman Empire, so mostly those countries where, of course, there were in parallel other great monuments, really. That's how the aforementioned, the MGH, are really about. Because at that point we reach what here, by approximation, is the real discipline. So it's not just an amatorial, say, condensation of whatever mostly the aristocracy learned, which was respectable because it was a sort of mix of theological studies, of again, all those things that were meant to inspire leadership. And so even the highest role I have, I sympathize with the elite, in spite of their fate or exactly at that point. But again, it's a memento against any kind of, again, you can't be at the top. You can always fall. That's also what tradition teaches us, for that matter, right? So as a discipline, in the sense that is taught, right? Definitely, I would say that historiography starts becoming some really serious from those times. Say the end of the 17th, the end of the actually, I really meant from the beginning, from the end of the 18th to and mostly the 19th century, right? So yes, from 18th century antiquarianists mostly onwards. The other periods, like say Herodotus is mostly speaking for the first time in a way that really molded the way we actually think, right? The entire history that we read and write has been fundamentally informed by the classical Hellenic historiography, and there is no way around that, right? There was something about antiquity that surely left a mark that we have just been trying to catch up with after the essentially the civilizational disaster, and the sense of essentially getting away from that. In fact, that sense of balance. I think that's why that historiography is so important. It's not just that we like, I don't know, the Greeks for some strange reason. Is that they objectively had something that nobody else had, and as far, especially as the intellectual side and what they could achieve, not necessarily just in parallel with other things, but as far as history is understood, it's definitely a very good moment to start from. I would say, actually, to finish the thing I was saying before, given that, yes, 18th century antiquarianists began that work, it's just from the 19th century, really, the end of the 18th, the 19th fully, that you have lots of disciplines also becoming really just, I don't know, thinking about anthropology, right, being a real thing, right, paleography or other, say, disciplines deeply connected with history, also the same archaeology, or really they acquire to consolidate something also as a method, because that's why we start considering them reliable from that point onwards to let's say mostly as history of historiography, rather than actual history, right? I work with 13th, 14th century chronicles, and to me they are incredibly insightful. That period was the peak of medieval civilization. I mean, those guys were really smart, and all the sources, as I was saying before, can tell you much more than you can imagine just by toying with them. But in many ways, because the people are literally just telling to you in plain words what they actually meant, and again, in a very intelligent way, essentially answering the same question that we still pose ourselves at the time. Because otherwise, what do you write history for if you don't make the reader actually interested in wondering more or less the same thing he would always throughout all history, considering that those are the closest informations that we can get to the times, right? So here the importance of the sources is always crucial. There is a method on how to handle the sources. In this regard, it would be important to realize how much of, say, contemporary publishing is not really serious. I think this is understandable, but many people tell me, well, what can I read? What author is better than another? Well, you should say, usually people who don't read much answer or people who don't legitimately know history that well wonder that, right? I think that true serious history books are never read, right? Not because they're not pleasant or properly conceived to be read, even sold as a actual reading material, right? For non-specialists, I mean, but because they are so important as far as the research is entailed, that in that sense are more severed from the pop interest, so that an average person would not understand how important those words he's reading are if there is no context to locate them in. This is a pity for sure, because there is a bit of a fracture. At least I think history has been changing popularly wise. I think we are to a further level of sinking. I remember that even 10 years ago, even with Facebook groups, etc., there was a completely different attitude towards history. People really wanted to know, there was a sense for the quality, etc. Today, people do not seem so interested in history anymore. They're interested in perhaps... Again, I'm not a follower. I don't know how people can listen, for example, to me or to any other YouTube channel, right, consistently, to give all those views and watch length. I really don't understand that. My best take is that they really want to hear your opinion as a person. In other words, we live in a sort of solitude for which we want a sort of imaginary friend from the other side of the screen to tell us how the thing really is, if we like the guy, right? I say I don't make Schwerpunkt for friendship, right? But at least I try to establish a sort of trust with the audience, because I think it can be useful, right? And I don't care if I get a few views or whatever. What I really care is that the things I say can be used positively, right? And that they work, right? Because they're based on reality. They're based on a series of experiences that I had, through which I said, look, I'm glad to have learned this thing for myself, because it was really useful to understand the world. So being here and telling it to the others. And sometimes, again, it can sound a bit beyond. It can sound a bit like, but I haven't been there, I don't know what you're talking about, you're maybe just flattering yourself. Yeah, that can be, but because I think that standards are important, right? So if you don't challenge people, they don't react either. So I don't know whether my voice is to just boring, and I don't trigger particular emotion or whatever. But I speak for a very, very long time with the same tone, and always in this kind of sleepy mode or whatever, or sleepy sounding mode at least. But I count on delivering the actual meaning, right, of what I want to convey, that I deem to be important, satisfactory. I mean, look at this question. It's just it's already a lot, right? 4 lines long, right? But how much you can draw from it, how much you can discuss about it, and how many other considerations immediately, spontaneously emerge from the whole reasoning, right? So answering this question, say, when did history, because as discipline is in brackets as much as the choice from the 18th century or Herodotus, well, history, of course, in the historiographical sense, as a genre, basically, is really, I would indicate Herodotus, but let's say history, again, is an existential condition, I would say. Everything that you can make even about history, if you want to mediate, is, again, we can make history of prehistory, right? History is connected in that sense, even just to written sources that, as you know, are not just about, they do not start in the 6th century BC, but millennia before. And so that can also be the boundary sometimes, because they were already reasoning in a historical sense. The same mythology is part of that. So there we get down to what to something that cannot categorize perhaps as history, because we decided arbitrarily so. But in terms of meaning, you see how we have placed meaning behind so many other things that are really useless in this degree. That's how I see that. So it says, I have a master's degree, but it's in philosophy. Alright, I don't know why you say that. Can get a bit of background, so maybe to characterize the answer. In fact, that's it, right? I have actually positive memories, as I said before, from high school about philosophy, but I don't think I could have ever studied it, because, again, it's about studying somebody else's opinions, or rather, let's say, belief systems, right, rather than like what actually happened, right? I'm more about that, right? And historians can, of course, be biased and all, and that they can be very ideological in the way they write and so on. But in my opinion, right, my experience, actually, say better, the sense is that we underestimated brutally sources, especially chronicles, things like that, because they're incredibly eloquent, and I think that they differentiate themselves legitimately from philosophy, because they don't try to make a system of interpretation normally, or at least they provide you with some basic information first, and then they give you something else. Philosophy is brilliant to sharpen the mind in a way, but when you say you approach it historically, the first feeling you have, especially even just talking with philosophy students, going to the philosophy faculty for the classes, the exams, and so on, is that there is a completely different attitude there, right? There is the sense that what you say and think as a person in general, as a philosopher or whatever, is to be held in some kind of consideration when, let's say, you have much more evidence to draw conclusions from by yourself. Let's say I don't trade the thing for the other, right? Again, I studied plenty of philosophers, but I've never been particularly in love with any of them. At least I could like some of them very much, then maybe rejecting them, having a sort of love and hate, at least, behavior towards them. Interestingly enough, changing ideas about them over time, but also seeing, first of all, the limits of these figures, and secondly, appreciating, however, let's say the double thread that is contained in every individual's thought, right? There is always a right and a wrong, right? And you want to understand how this balances in a person or in a theory or whatever, right? I had beautiful classes on Hobbes at university. Incidentally, while I was taking others on, the English Civil War, which was, very, very useful, as I understand, as an association. Then there were some more theoretical ones about communitarism and multiculturalism that weren't that ideological as you may think. Actually, they were quite balanced. They illustrated, like, more or less what is that these people really want, right? And trying to find the best solution. How do we cope with that politically? What about rights? What is that all about? And it teaches you, of course, it's fascinating, right? It's just that I'm not very sensitive to that kind of smartassery, right? I just feel that you can speak very well, you can express yourself very, very effectively, going to the point, very differently from how I do. But I also think that, let's say, everything needs to be fixed in a pattern as well. How important is it to have, let's say, a certain idea at a certain given time, and what is at the end of the day what we're willing to do for it? I think that the action speaks better in that sense, and even the action of making history, and even the history of philosophy for that matter, and trying to sort out how people were behaving and thinking and why. I think it's crucial, because philosophy and, say, history are the ones that really get closer to. There's, of course, anthropology. It depends, right? But I think that history, focusing on not necessarily on the microscopic, but on the actual events, right? So something that was carried out by someone, identifies more objectively the will, the drive, the degree, the belief of a culture or a civilization of a people, than philosophy can simply do. Because if you study philosophy is very useful, again, introductively to history, right? And you should even possibly keep studying it in the meanwhile. But in my opinion, at least as far as I've seen in university, it gets it unavoidably closer to history itself. That is to say, the more serious philosophy is, and the more it anchors itself to the actual historical context, and so also other things that are not merely philosophical. That is to say, how do we interpret, I don't know, this guy from his background, right? You need at least a historical notion of that, which may be, in fact, normally that's what I think mostly the philosophy research about, like understanding, like, by whom were these people influenced? Like, how did they come up with those ideas? And I think, having a historical understanding is greater than many others. Of course, you shall read literature. You should understand what books existed in this guy's libraries and whatever. That's more also philological work. But again, I thought that the enucleation just of a belief is important, but it can easily be modified if not provided with an adequate historical background, right? I believe that philosophy definitely resents, at least it's one of those subjects where you find there is definitely more political extremism in philosophy than in history faculties. There is absolutely no doubt about this, at least in my experience where I come from. Philosophy faculty is extremely loaded in very strong, say, strongly political beliefs, right? That are also strangely in the sense opposed to one another, meaning that, that's the question I always pose. Like, of course, we need civilizationally to say antagonism and conflict, etc. But how can people believe so radically opposite things and not realizing that there's something in between that are lacking, right? That doesn't speak of even just a high philosophical education, right? Because if you can't see really where the other comes from and why, you can't even see yourself how biased you really are, right? At least what struck me again is not the because I haven't seen that, like the ease with which a certain extremistic idea can be debunked, but how normally extremistic from another point of view that the people really are. Instead, university, say, in many ways, at least in method, how it was showed even by people that, aside from their subjects, were somehow politically inclined, without no surprise, were actually very cold and accurate and competent in their own field. So that's, again, as I was saying before, the function of it all. It's how much you learn that actually helps you liberating from that inclination. Right, philosophy students I've met, friends, whatever, they were very theoretical. There is nothing to do about that. Like, normally historians are criticized for being, it's all theory. It's a famous cliche about history. It's really not, right? History is rooted properly in what actually happened, which is a completely different. Of course, you were not there, but not even if you are there now, right? You can easily reconstruct what is happening around you, and just leaving somebody knowing or remembering accurately about it. So that's not a problem that begins or even ends with history. Philosophy is a bit, in my opinion, more detached. I mean, the stereotype of the hyper-uranium, and I don't know, a typical question I remember I asked to a bunch of philosophy students, so why did you decide to study philosophy? People said, we don't know, right? No, that was the typical answer. Instead, as a historian, I think we all have an answer, like, I want to know the specific, say, not topic, but just I think it's important because, I don't know, politically, it tells us where we are right now, that it gives you the security of basing yourself on something that otherwise, as we just said, is not really easily demonstrable on like in a laboratorium. Like a hard scientific thing, right? It, however, mostly ends there, even when there are theoretical models involved or whatever. It's mostly just a step-by-step thing that just awaits for the empirical proof. Doesn't matter such a large, enormous, great, theoretical, bold, intuitive, genial, insightful theoretical work. I don't want to deny that, but let's say history in this sense is much more funambolic. In that sense, I've never really fully gotten philosophy. Maybe it's just my nature or my character that doesn't make me excessively inclined towards that. I love literature in general, and of course every literature can be seen as philosophy, as it can be seen as history. So I'm sure that there's a deep meeting point, and aside from certain fanatism, I think that philosophy students were at least nice interlocutors most of the time. So that's at best what I can understand. But at least the concreteness, right? Let's be honest about the fact that philosophy is relatively more speculative, and that history was more concrete, as I think the main divide. And this divide exists. You can phrase it in different ways. You can complain against historians, whatever, but at least my experience is that I could have never studied philosophy because I need a firm ground to stand on, and not the one made up, again, by ideologies either, right, which normally are, again, made outside of the historical process, because historians are, at least, one of the great satisfactions, you would say, with a meager consolation of my historical path is that at least I, when I talk to people, when I cope with situations and deal with problems, etc., I noticed that I do still follow the historical method. Like, I want to know what happened precisely. I need to know, because I realize it's the only way to fix things. Right? I must make a research about that, must be provided with reliable information. For example, if a person cannot express themselves adequately, and there are lots of people who admittedly have very kind of lots of big problems, a sort of the dysfunctionality, like a sort of illiteracy, the fact that they are increasing. Like, how can you get an actual explanation from them? How can they handle more complex? So you must train yourself to do that. You must speak a lot. You must try to solve, again, ever more complex systems. We were talking about it before. And after that, you will become more effective. It's not easy. Even speaking is, for example, in my native language, I don't talk so much. Actually, I'm pretty silent. I'm pretty quiet. It's just with Schwerpunkt that I find this valve, right, of venting, and aside from whenever I can speak at university or whatever, the thing makes me really think out loud all the things that at some point I feel the need of telling. Today I wanted to make a video about the Earldom of Ulster, that is scheduled for tomorrow, by the way, and I don't know, this evening I felt the need of talking about this stuff. I had this question from some day ago, and I said, look, I need to, but for other reasons, not for this question. I needed to speak my mind, because I had some intuitions, some ideas. I wanted to test them. And I know that explaining them means to dominate them. Never underestimate this. Again, learning is very different, reading is very different from learning and from understanding, because once you read, you don't repeat, you don't study, you don't speak, you don't actually test yourself in your comprehension, in your capacity of expression. Right? This makes it all a very different experience, and you will learn much less, as a matter of fact. So now I just digress on philosophy for the meme of it, right? Not because it was about the question in the first place. So finally, what are some good introductory texts to the discipline? Now, this is interesting because, as I said at the beginning, I don't think that it's very useful to introduce someone to this history. Again, as I hinted at before, I've noticed an incredible amount of YouTubers making, of historians, right, making YouTube videos. Not really, incredible amount. I maybe just know a couple, but what are the odds, right? And I spotted that polarization, right? Either there are the guys who want to make it a sort of the conservative point, or criticizing the leftistic ideas, or there are actual leftists who want to make their own propaganda, right? And there is not an easy middle ground. However, given that objectively that kind of Marxistic flavor, if not stench, has actually, just to remain objective, by the way, and I'm serious about it, is seemingly prevalent, right? Especially among the best outspoken YouTubers who were just very proud of their recent history degrees and all the stuff. They want to speak their mouth. There is this enormous sense of this is positive in a way, the necessity of method, right? It almost, however, to the limits of paranoia. That is to say, for example, so they make extremely informed videos in terms of sourcing, right? And they're much smaller videos, by the way. They are scripted. They take probably a lot to make, nothing like the format that I do. And I do my type of videos because I think it's funny, first of all, for me, because I do it essentially for speaking again out my mind. And I, however, hardly ever, like, yes, I quote sources, I refer to it, but I think making, honestly, and again, if you actually knew where I doctored, you would say, really? Yes. I don't, by saying this, like, I don't give a damn about giving the sources, right? I give them the sources in my articles. I give them the sources whenever I have to do something serious. YouTube, you can make it a more serious experience, and you can be informed, but first of all, when it gets into that political mode, it sounds more like I want to be right, so I will list all the sources to prove this guy wrong, and most of the times it's just like a premise of an introduction of how to theoretically debate this guy, and very often there is no substance to it. There is not an alternative view of the world. There is just an iconoclastic disintegration of positions are objectively very stupid most of the time, so that are easy to criticize, but they are easy to criticize like with, I don't know, one bit by bit, and not making an entire comprehensive, cogent, significant point. Also in terms of saying, that's the other thing I actually think. And these people get that kind of passive-aggressive, usually the more they are kind of materialistic, deterministic, Marxistic, because they assume that that's a sort of, I don't know, that's actually true, right? That's actually how the world works, and so they don't even need to actually expose their own theories accordingly to convince you about that. If you're so convinced about it, just give the damn data. You squeeze all that kind of sources in that are just references to books mostly, again, not even actual quoting or general problems or whatever. I advise this article, I advise this book, whatever. Nobody cares, right? I don't think it's important, and I think, on the contrary, that the reason why such ideologism is out there is that people follow, like dogs, this kind of pseudo kind of universal values that are just, again, because one scholar in a given university that is maybe the only one that you know, because just the knowledge of the variety of academic cultures, and also the high level of them, for example, the ones existing in continental Europe by a degree. And I'm partisan here, but it is the case, because the ranks speak clearly. They're not even touched, right? And here we don't make this kind of Marxistic or structuralistic or whatever, or even just what smells of that, right? It doesn't have to be open about that. But it just makes you follow, again, people who are just finite, right? That are just, again, this person teaches social history, this university, and so I quote her because it's the only, I don't know, I don't know any other who has debunked this idea, meaning has written, another scholar teaching another university, writing a book or an article exactly responding to that and debunking it. Otherwise, whoever you are, even if you are actually a competent professional and expert in your own field, you can't speak, because what the hell are you, right? So this thing as even not speaking your mind or making the point, but always hiding behind the skirt of somebody, some name, as if these people were demigods or even were respectable in their own actual quality of academic education. Frankly, it's disgusting, and I have developed a true repulsion toward this kind of idea. So the question here is legitimate. I don't want to say that there aren't books that would help to introduce to the discipline as is expressed here, but in my opinion, I first of all have never been fond, as I was saying before, of scholarship in the first place. To me, scholarship, of course, is useful. There are always been authors that I've liked or disliked, whatever, and I use them constantly. I'm very happy in any work when I can quote the right passage that harmonizes the entire script that that is to the point, that is exactly the term, the expression that best suited and crown your own and supports your own theory. But I see it as an accessory to my own point, which is actually, and perhaps because I'm the only one who deals with what I do, sounds a bit too protagonistic, is definitely the most important thing that has ever been written on that topic. So I've never ventured even minimally in the history of historiography, also because it's actually painful. To this point, we have so much so many books written that you can't even, like, how do you even make a PhD in history of historiography? Right, I had to quote a relatively small amount of works for my work. Were like around, I think, 700, 600, something like that. And that's a field that nobody researches. Can you imagine the historiography of, I don't know, cognitive science? How the hell do you do that? Right? Even in 3 years, or even in 4, or in 5. Like, it must be approximated, because you can't humanly read everything or understand everything in that short amount of time for how much is being published. Like 50 years ago, it wasn't like that. There were just maybe 3 books on the main ones that had dominated the field and had legitimately summed up what had been written up to that point satisfactorily. Today, it's a wholly different thing. So, I can't think of specific classics that you can use for history. I like mostly, you see it from the type of topics that I choose. Like, I like this series, I like compilations, I like encyclopedias, I like, what provides you with the actual evidential history and not too many, circles around the actual subject matter. I wouldn't quote even I wouldn't mention even the books that I was actually given at the beginning of the university to be introduced, especially to I remember just the ones about medieval history. Frankly, if I were told the titles about the modern contemporary one, I would probably, and I remember them, yes, too. But I mean, they were first of all introductions to the actual eras. So that is to say, Block for the Middle Ages, right? You can't disagree with him. It's one of those structuralists that you actually would like to get rid of, at least in the philosophy of it. Very interesting historical figure. I loved Kantorowicz, for example, but this is not about history. This is because I loved, I don't know, Frederick II, or I liked The King's Two Bodies as a work. But I would, in that sense, it's just my personal path that brought me to like that, right? So it's just anecdotal. It's just, I don't know. I had that. I can't mention articles of obscure, even archaeologists, about, I don't know, the weapons of Longbirds. That nobody. It's even short stuff, like not even dramatically well written, but I don't know, they had an impact on me, because at that time, again, I needed those and I was using them profitably to my ends. But if I were to just say, okay, introduce this to history, there are, again, it's plenty of books that talk about that. But even if I knew 100 of them, I wouldn't tell you the name of even one, because I think it's the worst. Right, I understand that a philosopher may find that more interesting, because the entire point is understanding how we must think history. To me, the point is we must understand what happened. Right, you must know the story, and then only when you know the story, you can start making your own philosophy of history. That's how it happened for me. I believe before it wasn't possible objectively. It's just like making a philosophy of philosophy. How is it even possible, right? But even banally, like, do you think that anyone can write a book about the 20th century, like summing up the 20th century. Like at best, of course, you have manuals that squeeze in, I don't know, the 19th, the 20th, but then what? It's just a list of notions, and there is not a general, say, reflection or understanding. And then I can't open any book here again. Let's see. This was the contemporary manual that I had back then. First, I will not tell which subject came up, because otherwise you would think it's too sinister. And here, first of all, there is a banality. There is at least a statement here that they must take for granted, because it to a degree is true, but it's such a big statement that I must at least have a bibliography of the topic dealt by the same statement in a book of, at least this was held just for the 19th century, for the 20th century, as a matter of fact, of almost 500 pages, that would multiply that for all the lines of the book, and how many books I should read in order to answer, like even just to the entire 20th century. So this is just why I think that at least it's incredibly important to know the events. You must know, yes, what happened, even through manuals. Manuals, as a matter of fact, are very useful, because at least at the end they do have, or at least after every chapter, usually they have their own quick references to the topic that can immediately open you. I mean, it's maybe 5 books on a given topic. That means hundreds or thousands of other books referenced in the book. So you immediately understand that in order to be introduced to any given historical topic, all you have to do is to actually go read those books, if you really care. If you just think to learn history with a book or another, read, a bit of distraction in between, like, just give up entirely the thing. Again, you can find interesting topics to just chat with someone, but it has nothing to do with history. It has nothing to do with even having an actual historical culture, right? And the goal would be, and I insist enormously on this ever since I can remember, and it's one of the few things I never changed the idea about, that everybody should know by heart, practically, at least the manuals. That is to say, you cannot be, say, a medievalist like me and simply say, okay, well, contemporary history, I don't give a damn, because who cares? What does it have to do with that? It can never work. You cannot not know, right? But that's a double denial in English, right? So it's a positive, I guess. But that's, the essentials, at least, of all the eras. Just as a person, not even as a historian. Secondly, you should know that, because it should be a part, again, not a notion, but you should at least remember the structure of the chapter. You should remember what happened, again, politically, militarily, and in fact, socially, in a comprehensive. But that's the reason why you have manuals during the first year. That's why you have those specific data for, like, setting the basis, the methods. Unfortunately, however, that stuff, after the first year's exam, normally is not touched anymore. I think I made only one other contemporary history exam in 5 years, during the bachelor and the master, after the first year contemporary basic one. Right, which means that practically I know nothing, say, at a good degree of level, aside from what I read from personal interest, also as a historian, as a military historian, for example, about contemporary history, at least from a university as such. And you understand that since most kids that get to that point and just maybe won't even work with history afterwards, the necessity of knowing and just, further and pushing for and maintaining that sense of at least knowing the basis of everything is completely thrown out of the window. Like today, even in the best universities, it's notoriously like nobody knows that, nobody remembers that, nobody cares about that. First year, it's over. Then you will just hyperfixate on a given topic until you go to the grave, and you will not have known even how that topic consistently was, at least if you had studied, say, all the broader historical context. And this is a huge problem. It's the reason why we can't understand each other anymore. It's the reason why there are no standards. It's the reason why there is moral relativism simply as a personal identity, so the annihilation of humanity taking place, in case you didn't notice. So I absolutely advise to, if anything, to use manuals a lot, right? To begin from the actual basis that again basics that may not be satisfactory at all, but that at least should be known, and then passing gradually towards the more in-depth things, but never lacking the overall sense of whole, in fact, and the fact that you cannot give any value to anything if not in comparison to the whole. So not simply to another thing, including you, right? But the world entire. So the necessity of literally never stopping to learn anything, and being humble, at least in the measure in which you realize you acknowledge your own limits, while you're trying to let's say work in another direction, one of breaking those limits, right? So the question, I think, really gets poignant at this point, and this is like literally more or less how I see the thing, and I believe that this is more or less like at least the response I wanted to provide. Again, not definitive, not like I will surely come back often on these topics, but I think that I at least had the opportunity to update a bit of my, or at least to repeat myself, because I didn't change my views so much over time. At least I managed, if anything, to phrase them somehow better at times, and I hope this can help, can be what the person who asked was searching for. It can be useful also for others. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.